Hello friends, welcome once again to Rick's Garage. Today I'm going to be replacing the front brakes on this 2011 Chrysler 200. I'm just preparing to bring it into the garage, but there's a couple of things I want to point out first. The first thing I notice before beginning work is that there's a pretty heavy coating of brake dust on the wheel covers. If you look right there, you can see it. So that's a good indication that the brakes were done with inferior material. Also, as the person doing the work, you kind of like to know how the car is driving before you start. So, having taken the car out on the road, I noticed there's some pulsation on the brakes. That indicates either a warped rotor or material buildup on the rotor. With all this brake dust that I see on the hubcap, I believe it's probably the later, that there may be material building up on the rotor itself, and we may just need to do a little skin cut just to clean that up. Now that we're inside, out of that wind, hopefully you can hear me a little bit better. As you can see, I've gone ahead and jacked up the car off camera. Before we get started, I want to have a little safety moment. Make sure the car is supported by quality jack stands on a good level surface. Set your parking brake and chock the rear wheels. Don't be afraid to have a pair of safety glasses handy in case you use any power tools or a hammer. The first thing we want to do here is put the car in neutral, pump the brakes a few times, and give each wheel a little spin just to see if the calipers are sticking or not. With that done, we can go ahead and remove the wheel. You want to keep the respective wheels on each side of the vehicle. Some tires are directional, and most all the modern tires have pressure sensors in them. With the wheel off, we're going to go ahead and measure the thickness of the rotors. We need to determine if they can be resurfaced or they need to be replaced. In measuring the rotor, I've determined that the rotors must be discarded. They measure at 24.3 millimeters thick, and the legal limit is 24.4 millimeters. It will be easier to remove the caliper and bracket if you turn the wheel all the way to the right for this side and all the way to the left for the other side. Using a 14 millimeter socket, loosen and remove the slide pins. With the slide pins out, off camera, I lifted the caliper off the bracket and hung it up on the spring so it would be out of the way. Now you can take an 18 millimeter socket and remove the two bracket bolts. The top one I did off camera. With the caliper bracket on the bench, I removed one of the old pads. Alongside it, I placed one of the new pads. It's very easy to see the difference here. The new pad is wider, thicker, and can absorb a lot more heat. We have a very inferior pad that cannot absorb the proper amount of heat, coupled with the fact that the rotors were turned down below legal minimum thickness. These two factors most certainly caused the rotors to warp over time. Notice how easily the rotor came off. We're usually not that lucky, but there's a reason for it. Someone had placed a good coating of anti-seize on the hub. I've taken the new rotor to a bench I have outside the garage so I can clean it. I want to clean it in a well-ventilated area. Spray brake cleaner on it and wipe it down pretty good to remove any coating that the manufacturer may put on it to prevent rust. Off camera, I cleaned off the old anti-seize compound and applied a new coat. Also, you'll notice that I put on a pair of gloves as not to contaminate the clean surfaces of the rotor. After slipping the rotor back on, I'm installing thick washers and a couple of the lug nuts to hold it tightly in place. You don't want it flopping around when you're trying to install the loaded bracket. I've taken the bracket to my outside bench to prepare it for loading. First, I'm removing with a pair of pliers the old clips, and then I'm going to pull the rubber boots off. Next, I'm going to take a wire wheel and clean the journals where the clips go. Next, I'm going to go ahead and fill up the glide pin bores with brake cleaner. Then I'm going to take a small bottle brush and clean them out really good. I want all that old grease out of there. When you finish brushing them, give them one last blast with the brake cleaner. Off camera, I went ahead and cleaned the slide pins. It looks like we can reuse them. Now I'm going to go ahead and install the anti-rattle boot. The pin with the anti-rattle boot is installed in the bottom of the bracket, whereas the pin without the boot is installed on the top of the bracket. I really don't know why, but that's how it's done. There are two types of grease I use on the caliper brackets. The Silglide tubes I use to lubricate the slide pins. It's made for exactly that purpose. The CRC caliper grease is used to lubricate the clips that go into the bracket. That's where the pads come in contact with the bracket. It's made for exactly that purpose. What you see me doing here is I'm loading up the slide pin bores with the slide pin grease. You're probably going to get way too much grease in there. I expect I will do the same. If you have too much grease, when you try to push the slide pin in, it'll come right out. So just keep working it back and forth. You'll hear the air escaping until the slide pin stays in on its own, and you hear that nice suction sound when you pull it out. With the slide pin bores nicely lubricated, we're going to go ahead and install the new dust boots. Now we're going to go ahead and install the new caliper bracket clips. Those are perfectly symmetrical. They're all the same. They'll only go one way, so you don't have to worry about a left or right or up or down. Just put them in exactly how you took out the old ones. The last thing we're going to do to prepare the caliper brackets is to lubricate the part of the clips that come in contact with the pads. These lubricating points are very important. Not only does the caliper have to have the ability to slide back and forth on the bracket, so do the pads. Using a clean Q-tip, put a little dab of the caliper grease on each of the contact points. Not too much. You don't want it getting on the rotor or the pads themselves. What I've gone ahead and done here is clamped one of the old rotors into my bench vise. Then I placed the bracket we just prepared on top. It's much easier to load up the bracket in this manner rather than trying to do it on the car. Before we install the inner pad, we must connect the brake wear indicator. This consists of a little clip that attaches to the inner pad. It will give you a warning by contacting the rotor and making a chirping sound, letting you know it's time to replace the brakes. Off camera, I've gone ahead and spun the rotor around. The wear indicator will be locked in place by slipping it through the gap in one of the clips we installed earlier. I'm going to try to bring a light over so you can see a little bit better how the wear indicator fits into the bracket clips. With the caliper bracket now fully loaded, we can go ahead and install it on the car. I'll tighten the bolts off camera. As the old brakes wear, the piston constantly moves outward to keep the brakes in the proper adjustment. Therefore, before we can install the caliper back over the rotor, we have to press the piston back in. I use the top works of an old puller set. Some people use a C-clamp. Either will work. Before you start to press the piston in, make sure the cap is removed on your master cylinder. You will actually be pushing brake fluid back into the master cylinder reservoir. Have someone keep an eye on this as you do it so that the reservoir will not overflow. Usually it doesn't. Now that the piston has been pressed back into the caliper, you can carefully slip it over the rotor. Be careful not to fold over the dust boots. They must be kept in line with the bracket and the caliper holes. The actual glide pins slip through all three. With the glide pins installed, you can go ahead and tighten them. With the caliper installed, you have to pump the brakes until you feel the pedal. But before you do this, make sure you install the cap back on the master cylinder. After you've finished pumping the brakes, try to turn the rotor to make sure it's moving freely. So friends, we're pretty much done here. You just have to reinstall your wheels. So I thank you once again for watching Rick's Garage, and we hopefully will see you again next time.